following podcast contains mature language and spoilers. Listener discretion is advised. The publisher DK put out the DC Comics Encyclopedia, the definitive guide to the characters of the DC Universe, in 2004. By that point, I had closed down my shop, and I was getting a shitty little discount from my second choice comic shop after the first one closed down on me unexpectedly. Comic shops get lousy discounts on these things. If I remember correctly, we would get something like a 15 to 25% discount. If your comic shop gives you less than a 10% discount off your books, if you're a subscriber, you're in an abusive relationship, you need to get out of it. And so that means your shop's margin is like 15% or so, and that's assuming you even pick up the book, and typically the comic shop's going to get the book weeks, if not months, after a bookstore, certainly well after Amazon. You might as well go direct to the source. Now, I don't even remember if the book was solicited through previews. I'm pretty sure it was, though, and I'm pretty sure that I knew that my discount was going to suck, so I ordered it online. I was at a time where my living situation was unstable. I was in a lousy neighborhood, and so when they shipped the package to me, they didn't want to leave the package there, and so it went back to the distributor, and so it was a whole thing where I had to rush to try to get to the place because I was afraid they were going to send it back, because I didn't know how UPS or FedEx worked back then. And I was really anxious to get this book. I was really excited for it. It seemed like it was going to be up my alley. And so when I finally got it and cracked it open and brought it home and everything, I loved it. I love the DC Comics Encyclopedia. It's been one of my most indispensable resources throughout my fandom since 2004. Whenever somebody does something on Twitter where they're like, put a team together of these type of people, or, you know, which characters would you want, who's your top 5, yada yada, when it comes to DC stuff, pretty much my first recourse is to pull the encyclopedia off the shelf and start thumbing through it. It helps too that everybody who's involved with the production of this particular book was also heavily involved in DC Comics in the post-crisis period and beyond. The author's introduction is by Scott Beatty, who was the Batman group editor, Robert Greenberger, who was a historian and editorial presence at DC for decades. I think he was the one who wrote all the introductions to the DC Millennium editions in the year 2000. Phil Jimenez, who was, of course, one of their star artists, not as famous as a writer, but really good authorities, particularly when it comes to Wonder Woman stuff. And then Dan Wallace, he's the only one that I'm unfamiliar with. I feel like the DC Encyclopedia, to some degree, resonates with me the same way that Who's Who resonates with people a bit older than me, because it really is a definitive document of my DC universe. I came in post-crisis. I mean, I'd read stuff before then, but the post-crisis continuity is my jam. When I wanted a home in comics after I felt like I'd been abandoned when Claremont left the X-Men, and I was checking out all the other universes, shopped around. It was the DC continuity of 1986 through the early 2000s that I fell in love with. It's been about 15 years since that continuity was really relevant, and it's still dear to my heart. It's still easy for me to harken back to those days because I enjoyed those comics so much and became so invested in that universe. Because this is done by people who were very familiar with that universe, taking the characters that were familiar to me because of that, as well as a lot of obscurities. I love that too. And I loved that they made a point of having an international focus. There's a ton of Planet DC characters in here. There's a ton of Global Guardians. In fact, there were a few Global Guardians that were introduced in an issue of Justice League Quarterly, and all they were images on a screen. You know, there was a promise of introducing characters that were never introduced, and they went in there. I think it was Phil Jimenez in particular actually wrote biographies of all those characters, extra canonical, I guess you would say, because they never appeared in the comics for the most part. I think actually, once again, Jimenez featured some of the female characters in a Wonder Woman story arc, where I remember he went on to like the DC message boards and was soliciting fans to tell him all of the comic book heroines and villainesses that they could come up with so he could put them all into this one gigantic story. I think it was Wonder Woman 175, and that included some of those Global Guardians that he elaborated upon, but he also did the male ones, and just pretty much everything I would possibly care about is all in here. Now, obviously, there's huge omissions, the same type of people that got dropped from Who's Who. I call this my Zook clause. Zook was the imp that was the sidekick to Martian Manhunter for the last years of his solo series in the Silver Age, and I don't know that any DC resources ever reference that character. They try their best to forget that character ever existed. And so with any comic book reference, not just DC, there's always going to be those constant omissions, those people that you think should rate and don't make it. But overall, the core breadth of the DC universe was in that encyclopedia. And so for me, this is my easiest quick reference Bible, and it's a substantial volume. It's about 1.5 inches thick. The dimensions are nearly to an LP. It's not quite as wide, but it's about as tall. It's a hardcover, a beautiful Alex Ross cover. It's funny, while I was researching for this, I came across the original Diamond solicitation on the Previews World website, and it's a Trinity picture, but they did this horrible photoshopping of line art, and not even good line art, of Joker and Lex Luthor in the background, just to give you a sense of what the final cover would be. And it is true to that. You do have Joker and Brainiac, Luthor, Two-Face, Catwoman. That's just the front cover and the spine. So they made sure to get some villainous presence on here. And it's a different image of the Trinity, although they're the core, the focus of the cover. But it's just laughable how badly they mocked up their intent for the DC Encyclopedia on that website. As I mentioned, the universes chronicled in this book went away for the most part. Michael Bailey has been for years working on a podcast called Crisis to Crisis, where basically he shows that his fandom starts on Crisis Infinite Earths and ends with Infinite Crisis. And in retrospect, that was fairly true for me too. The first entry in the 2004 DC Encyclopedia is Abra Kadabra. It's a magician from the future who uses technology to create something akin to magic because he's from so far in the future that it appears to be magic, and he fights the Flash and he fucking loses. So how in the hell does somebody from, what is it, like the 60-some-odd century suck so bad? Abra Kadabra breaks my suspension of disbelief. And the thing about the Flash character is that they shouldn't have to have suspension of disbelief. You should be able to just buy totally into the fantasy, given that there's nothing about the Flash that really makes a lot of sense despite the usage of physics in the midst of your flashbacks. Ultimately, Flash still doesn't make any kind of sense because the human body couldn't handle what the Flash does. So you have to accept that stuff aside because you love the character, except I don't like the Flash, so I don't have to give a shit about Abra Kadabra. Next entry is Agamemno. He was a pastiche created for a fifth week event 20 some odd years ago. One thing I'm doing with the Who's editing is I'm trying to figure out what I do and do not have to address. And I'm bringing in a bunch of stuff that Cisco doesn't ask you to deal with. But I'm also in my mind thinking that if he ever makes it to the Secret Files and Origins, Agamemno has a Secret File and Origin, so I don't have to deal with this dumbass character until that happens. So that's where I'm at. Then there's an entry for Acrata, who is a Mexican superheroine. And like I said, I love international characters. I love seeing representation outside of the US and outside of white dudes. She was designed by Carlo Barberi when he was in his full-on Humberto Ramos phase, in this black and green costume with a featureless mask aside from wide eyes that appear to be crying tears. So she looks cool. I love the art style. It's one of the things I love about that version of the encyclopedia is that they even bothered. This is a character that's appeared barely at all, ever. Certainly doesn't have the same cultural impact as a Zook, for instance. I just love that she's there, but she's got nothing cool in terms of powers. Kind of a drag. When this book came out in 2004, I was still buying a handful of DC titles. I was doing Catwoman because Paul Gulacy was drawing it. Ed Brubaker's stories were good too, but that was the reason why I was buying it. I was getting JLA. I was getting Firestorm, Wonder Woman, of course, The Flash, because I liked Howard Porter. Howard Porter, I think, is one of the best Flash artists. It's a shame he never got a run on the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern. I feel like those were his two strongest characters in his JLA run. But the point is, I was still supporting DC floppies, plus getting some trades. Within a few years of that, the rot of DC Comics set in. In fact, Identity Crisis was coming out at the same time as this encyclopedia, and that was, I think, a major turning point for a lot of DC fans to recognize that the universe that they loved was being stripped away from them. I largely blame Dan Didio for that. It was also, I think, the transitioning out of the shepherds of that period of DC Comics, Jeanette Kahn, Paul Levitz, Dick Giordano. They were leaving. Didio and his people were coming in. It was a new regime. It was a new mentality. It wasn't the place that I wanted to be. And that's why 4 years later, when they did a revised edition, they're supposed to be updated. As much as I loved this version, I didn't pick that one up. And I'm sure part of it was that I didn't want to spend another $40 because even with the discount that you get online, it's still going to be a good $30+. And I just bought this one, a few years earlier. But also, somebody actually put a video up where they're flipping through a good chunk of the updated edition page by page. Unfortunately, there was supposed to be a second part that doesn't either appear to be online anymore or never was in the first place. And so I was going along with this guy page by page and seeing the differences between the two just to see if there was anything that really provoked me to buy one, because I'll occasionally see a copy of the revised edition at half price books, which is still a good $15, $20 purchase. But looking at it page by page, there just wasn't enough there. They would expand the obvious people. Catwoman got an extra 2 pages, Batman, Green Lantern, all that kind of stuff. I don't care about those guys. I know what was going on in their stuff. Those are the big famous characters. They're not going to slip under the radar for the most part. If you read previews catalog on a monthly basis, you probably know anything they were going to have in that update. And they would change out pictures like Arsenal. I think they they kept the name Arsenal, but they showed him in his red arrow costume, which was just a red variation on Green Arrow's costume. I always hated it. I thought that was stupid. I realized Speedy's a dumb name, but he had a great costume, so you should put him in that, not a cheesy, color swap of Green Arrow's costume. And while I didn't particularly like the Arsenal costume from when he was a member of the Outsiders, the image from the first edition is a Tom Rainey. The image from the second edition is an Ed Bennis. In almost any circumstance, I can't think of a circumstance where I wouldn't prefer Tom Rainey anything over Ed Bennis anything. But there was a lot of that kind of thing. Like, for instance, on the Firestorm entry, they swapped out a Ronnie Raymond image for a Jason Rush image. Like I said, I was reading Firestorm, so I wouldn't have had a problem with that. But it was like, they even found an image of Rush that resembled the image they had of Ronnie Raymond. So they might as well just change the tint of the skin color. There just wasn't enough of a substantial difference between the two editions. Aside from a really nice Alex Ross cover again, it was the one where it was a riff on Challenge of the Super Friends. I think he might have actually been working on Injustice at the time, so it might have been like sort of a cross promotion. And so if I could steal a copy of, if I could steal a dust cover off of a copy from Half Price Books, that might be worth it for me. I'm not going to rebuy the whole edition again. They actually did a third edition in 2016, and by that point, we were 4 years into the New 52, and so the writers listed on that one are Alan Cowsill, Alex Irving, Steve Korta, Matt Manning, Stephen Wynn Vicek, and Sven Wilson. And then they have additional text credits that are carried over from the previous edition. Obviously, in 2016, I had no interest in buying this. We'll talk a little bit about A.R.G.U.S. And A.R.G.U.S is an acronym for something that I don't care about. I don't understand why A.R.G.U.S exists. I feel like A.R.G.U.S, the whole reason why there's an A.R.G.U.S is because Marvel Comics has S.H.I.E.L.D. and because it's one of those things that I hate so much in comics, the incestuous nature, where this company has a thing and so you have to have your duplicate version in your own universe. And the fact is DC Comics has the DEO, which was created in the late 90s, which is the Department of Extranormal Operations, whose job is basically a government agency who deals with metahumans and metahuman activity. Perfect. Stop. You already did it. That's all you needed. Back around 88, Paul Kupperberg and John Byrne, they did Checkmate, where it was DC's, it was another ripoff of S.H.I.E.L.D., let's be honest. But they had the conceit of the organization was modeled after a chessboard, and so you've got knights and rooks and kings and queens, all that kind of stuff. That's cool. That's one of those kid-friendly ideas. You love the idea of you take this game that's very familiar, it has centuries, cultural impact, and you transpose it onto a comic book concept. And again, the whole super spy thing, it's a 60s artifact. It doesn't need to exist, but you kind of want it to exist in comics. It makes sense in comics. And so DC's got Checkmate. So don't do a lousy knockoff of what Marvel does. Do your version of that your own way. Checkmate did that. The DEO did that. A.R.G.U.S basically has the same function as both Checkmate as DEO, and it's an acronym for something nobody cares about. So just don't do A.R.G.U.S. So I'm very on the anti-A.R.G.U.S kick. Aside from the fact that Steve Trevor has a primary role in that, he's very visible, and I like that Steve Trevor's got his own thing going on, besides being the Wonder Woman cheerleader. Adam Strange, I just have to make a point of referencing him because I always liked this guy's look, or at least I did when I was younger. I dig the whole Finn thing and him being mid-century atomic age, sci-fi adventure hero. But what I learned from actually reading Adam Strange stories is that he's boring. His whole, for starters, he's written by Gardner Fox, and all apologies to fans of that writer, and with full acknowledgement of his enormous contributions to comics and his just monumental place in the evolution of the medium, origination of concepts that are dear to my heart, like Justice Society, JLA. But I usually board it here by Gardner Fox scripts. And Adam Strange's whole deal is that he goes to a planet of people who are wimps, people who are smart enough to send a beam to another planet to grab heroes and teleport them back across millions of light years or whatever to their planet, but they're feeble-minded otherwise, beyond those scientific accomplishments. And so basically this dude uses grade school, maybe middle school science to beat various bug-eyed monsters and the like. Usually not particularly well-applied science either, from what I've seen, in just painfully boring stories with cardboard characters. He's your dad as a superhero. He's like the guy who comes up with a use for duct tape and we're all supposed to cheer him. It's just rudimentary science DIY stuff and not particularly well applied. He's just like the white dude who comes in and saves the entire world with his mediocrity. And we're were all supposed to cheer for him. Obviously, the look has gotten very dated. The more I think about Adam Strange, the less I know what to do with this guy. Unfortunately, it was part of the Cisco's challenge, and because he was an early space guy who could get around, I got a little bit of use out of him for that reason. But it's always about me getting to explore whatever sci-fi concept he's running into. I just don't see the value in Adam Strange. Kind of a coolish name, but I don't understand where this guy would have a place in the modern conversation. This very retrograde concept. They keep trying to make Adam Strange happen. They've been doing it for decades. It's not going to happen. And I do wish they would just figure out something to do with his lore. It's not like the Iranians are particularly compelling either. It used to be I'd be like, oh, cool, Adam Strange. I'd like to know more about that guy. And I'm at a point in my life where it's like, I know everything I need to know about Adam Strange. I don't want to read any more stories about this guy. So I remember first seeing Agent Liberty in the early days of picking up like advanced comics and previews. I thought that he looked cool. He reminded me a little bit of Marvel's U.S. agent. And he's apparently one of these overzealous conspiracy types. I've never read anything with this dude that was remotely interesting. But just in case you did not know, I believe they killed him off as part of the lead up to the World of New Krypton stuff. And they introduced the female version of Agent Liberty, which you didn't know about, and they killed her too. So character doesn't matter. You've got the All-Star Squadron listed, which is a bizarre thing to have in a book related to even Rebirth. DC has basically done their level best to eradicate things like the All-Star Squadron since Crisis on Infinite Earths. So it's always bizarre to see that in one of their reference books. They should probably get zooked. But you did actually have the All-Star JSA book a few years back, an attempt at a spinoff. It's so funny. It's like everybody was into JSA when Jeff Johns was at his peak on it. And so they decided to put out the JSA spinoff book after he's already left and the book's in decline. Now you want to do the spinoff. But I guess that's the reason why All-Star Squadron gets an entry. You have All-Caste, which is, part of my generation, I suppose. Red Hood's a thing, I guess, right? It's like, it's still kind of hard for me to wrap my brain around that Jason Todd must have his own fan following because various incarnations of the Red Hood title have been going on since 2011. They made a cartoon about it. He hasn't made it into live action yet, but like he has lore now. Jason Todd has a lore. That's weird. I don't understand that. That's bizarre to me. I just have trouble wrapping my brain around that. This is the kid who people called in to kill off. Rob Kelly specifically helped to murder Jason Todd. It was a pretty slim margin, so I think Rob Kelly specifically helped to push it over the line. People called to kill this kid. He was dead for decades. He's basically the Bucky of DC Comics, and I guess like Winter Soldier, he's a thing, and people are a fan of this thing, and people wanted to see this thing adapted in other places, and he has lore, and it's like, what? But he's Jason Todd. And I like Jason Todd. In particular, I remember reading The Cult. I was an early fan of trade waiting, or not even trade waiting. I was just an early fan of trades. I loved collected editions. One of the things that was so frustrating to me as a kid buying comics off the newsstand is you'd get a story and it wouldn't be completed that issue, and then depending on what newsstand you bought it off of, you may not have the chance to ever read the end of that story. Very frustrating. I loved trade paperbacks going back to the Fireside edition of Captain America: Symbol of Liberty, which of course is not a collection of a storyline. It's just a collection of sort of greatest hits. But I loved having a bunch of stories about a character that I was interested in all in one place. And so I've always been a trade guy. I moved from floppies to trade probably earlier than most. And probably during the big Batman kick of 89 or so, I bought the trade of the Cult. I enjoyed how Robin was portrayed in that. And it was clear to me that this kid was not Dick Grayson. I love Dick Grayson too. But I love that Jason Todd was kind of doing his own thing. And he was kind of a punk and kind of a brat and definitely more violence prone. I dug that. But he died. And it was a big deal when he died. Just like with Bucky Barnes, I feel like he should just still be dead. It bothers me that he's not dead. But he isn't dead. And he has this thing called the All-Caste, which was a semi-good League of Assassins, martial artists. They were complicit in the creation of an evil organization that did harm to mankind. And so they're trying to find people to act as agents of change to overturn the darkness that they helped to unleash. And of all people, Jason Todd was somebody they recruited and trained to be like a super badass martial artist. So that's a thing that's apparently gone on throughout the Red Hood storyline, is this All-Caste thing. So if you didn't know that, there you go. I was completely out of DC. The New 52, while I'd gotten hopes up about this huge revision that they were doing at DC Comics, as the books came out and I tried them, I realized that it was just an absolute clusterfuck, just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what stuck, very haphazardly. My particular journey with that is best exemplified by Stormwatch. It's like I kept waiting for them to announce a Martian Manhunter solo series or team book, and he finally showed up on like the tail end of the New 52 as a member of Stormwatch, which was super weird. Everybody thought that was incredibly weird. But I got really hyped about it because I actually liked the Wildstorm characters. Basically my second favorite comic company for the longest time was the Wildstorm division of Image Comics. I cheered when Wildstorm was bought by DC. I really saw a lot of potential in integrating the Wildstorm characters, and that never amounted to anything good. DC actually ruined Wildstorm, unfortunately. And I was warned about that too. One of my customers at the shop at the time when I was cheering this was like, I think this is not going to go well. I think DC is going to ruin the company. I'm like, we will see. And he was 100% right. That's exactly what happened. But after, running the ship aground at Wildstorm, seeing the Wildstorm characters finally integrated into DC the way that, say, the Charlton characters have been integrated after Crisis on Infinite Earths, I saw a lot of potential there. And I loved that Martian Manhunter was at the foreground of that. If you think about it, Martian Manhunter was sort of the ambassador to a lot of the Charlton characters, because in particular, Blue Beetle and Captain Atom were both members of Justice League International. And, at that point in time when that book was launched, these were obscure characters who'd been published mostly in the 1960s by a small company. A lot of fans were not familiar with them, and DC was taking advantage of that. They were doing massive revisions of those characters. I remember I talked to J.M. DeMatteis a while back, and I was asking him about some of the changes he made to Martian Manhunter in that time period. He was saying, well, the thing is, at that point in time, people wanted change. They welcome change. It's obviously different now. People want, have a more conservative take on superheroes and want a more traditional canon-based approach to the characters. But in the mid-'80s, everything needed a sprucing up. Everybody wanted to do something edgy and new and different, and they were doing that with the Charlton characters. But because they were not as guarded as a lot of the DC icons, Giffen talked a lot about how when he got on the Justice League, he was hoping to get Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the big icons, and all those characters were being heavily revised and with very protective, big name comic creators. And so he didn't get the big names for Justice League. They weren't allowed to be given to him. And so he was sort of having to make do with who he could get. But one avenue he had was to grab these Charlton characters who were awesome and he had some familiarity with, that they were still figuring out what they were doing with them. And so they had a lot more flexibility to allow for those characters to develop within Justice League International than the big icons would have had. And so because Martian Manhunter was also developing into a much more visible character because of JLI, because let's face it, he was the only founding member of the Justice League aside from Batman that they were allowing in the book, and there was the constant threat of Batman being pulled out of the book. And so they leaned kind of heavily into Martian Manhunter. In the 7th issue, they made him the team leader just in case they lost Batman, I guess, because of the international scope. They decided that Batman needed to be less visible. He couldn't take the spotlight of being the leader of the Justice League on an international scale, so they made it Martian Manhunter. And so they leaned into Manhunter a lot more alongside the Charlton characters. Those characters were all developed and became fan favorites in that time period together. For Martian Manhunter to be buddies with the Charlton characters, it was almost like the next generation of that. Okay, here's a new Martian Manhunter. We're going to try to give him a little bit more flair. He's a guy who never worked great as a solo character, never has been commercially viable in that regard. Here's his new shot amongst the New 52, and he's going to be redeveloped alongside the Wildstorm characters as part of the DC universe, as part of an integration. And I was really excited for that. I thought that was a great way to go with the character. As much as I wanted him to have a solo book, it was so much more interesting to me for him to be doing that than a Justice League International book, which, as you may recall, they did do one of those and nobody cared for it and it got canceled very quickly. Dan Jurgens wrote that, and I would say that he's lucky that Dan Votto followed his run on Justice League International, or he would be the worst writer. I can't say that he'd be the worst Justice League overall. So I was really, really excited for Stormwatch. And so I was buying that book monthly and I had such high hopes for it. And my understanding is that DC was just dicking with the writer Paul Cornell so much that none of the stuff he wanted to do ended up coming to fruition. He quit after like 6 issues, and then they had a bunch of fill-ins, and finally Jim Starlin ultimately took it over. But if Cornell left with 6 or so, it took until probably like 15 or 16 before they get Jim Starlin on there. And then there are all these fill-in guys. And in the midst of that, somebody decided, okay, not only are we going to have Martian Manhunter lead this book and have it solely be essentially Wildstorm characters, although Starlin brought in Lobo super randomly, but the Martian Manhunter is going to mind wipe everybody before he leaves. And so nobody's going to even remember that he was ever a member of the team, which makes really no sense because we did see the Stormwatch characters in some semi-high profile encounters. And I think somewhere in the midst of there, they were fighting the Red Lanterns. So obviously there were people outside of the Stormwatch team that would have known that he was involved with them. It made no sense aside from they just decided they didn't want Martian Manhunter to have anything to do with those Wildstorm characters retroactively. It was stupid and short-sighted, and it negated pretty much the first year of Stormwatch. And then the book itself ended up not amounting to anything because it was one of those things where it was the worst of both worlds. People who loved the characters as Wildstorm characters didn't appreciate them being integrated into DC, didn't like the changes that were made to them. In particular, I remember a lot of griping about Midnighter and his dumb, pointy chin thing, looked like a dildo. And then the DC fans weren't happy because they didn't want to read about these stupid Wildstorm characters. They didn't buy those books years back, and so they didn't want their universe being cluttered up with these Wildstorm guys. the DC guys mostly rejected the Wildstorm properties, and those properties went away pretty quickly. Now, I think there's more to it than just the fans rejecting them. I think there was some licensing issues or some royalty issues, because it doesn't make sense that those characters would all up and disappear pretty much right after Future's End. They almost like that was used to write the characters out of the DC universe and stop mentioning them. Writers are always going to want to play with whatever toys you'll let them have. And I'm sure that there were Wildstorm fans that would have loved to have done like an Authority book or allude to the Authority. And the fact that none of those characters were appearing anywhere tells me that there was somebody at DC telling them they couldn't have those characters. But you can also see it in the DC Comics Encyclopedia from 2016. I think there's an entry for Stormwatch and for Voodoo. Grifter, who had a solo series, which I think may have actually run longer than Voodoo's, doesn't get an entry. How do you leave off a starring character of a book from the previous 4 years? Especially in a book that's really kind of focused on the New 52, although this also came out around the time of Rebirth, so it's this weird little hybrid where they're still working on the Rebirth books while also reflecting a lot of the New 52 changes. And I know that seems like a really big tangent. We've been talking about Wildstorm for a long time here, but stay with me. This will actually become somewhat relevant. One of the real peculiarities of the 2016 Encyclopedia was a section called Roll Call. So obviously with the New 52, DC wanted to put their best face forward. They wanted to do the properties they thought would most easily be communicated to new audiences, foreground their most popular concepts, and maybe push the more embarrassing stuff to the background. And so this is 4 years into the New 52 at this point, and there's a bunch of properties that rated full entries in the previous encyclopedias that maybe hadn't been reintroduced into the New 52 or just weren't priorities. And so they stuck a bunch of these people that used to be rated into a little small section where they got not even really a paragraph, but just a few sentences and some headshots. Just as an example, Abra Kadabra. This is where I learned about Agent Liberty 2, Airwave 2, Amazing Grace, Andromeda, Angleman, Anima, Antithesis, Apparition, Aquawoman, Argent 2, Argus, Arcot, Artemis 3, Aryan Brigade, Asmodel. That's the first page of the roll call. And again, it's headshots, a few bits of information, and just a few lines about this character. Just a way of acknowledging these properties without giving them the benefit of a full entry. And again, these were characters that did rate previously. And the fact is, the 2016 Encyclopedia is about as massive as the first series one. You know, they're both hardcovers. They're both similar dimensions, exact same price, even though they're better than a decade apart. So obviously they had roughly the same amount of room. They just didn't want to devote it to these characters because they didn't quite rate. But there's one really peculiar inclusion, and I'm just going to read the whole thing to you. So it's for Anansa, the Spider Queen. She debuted in Animal Man number 81, March 1995. So to put that in context, we are deep into the Vertigo area. Vertigo was the line of mature readers' books that tend to have more supernatural leanings, definitely more mature themes. And for the longest time, there's a partition between the mainstream DC universe and Vertigo because they didn't want all this mature stuff in their superhero universe. And so it would make perfect sense why that material wouldn't make it into the earlier editions of the Encyclopedia. Animal Man 81 is the set of 10 issues that saw the end of that series. I believe it ends with 89. So this is really close to the end of the run of that character. So for her to be included in this edition, you have to assume, okay, well, there must be some element of inclusion here. Maybe she's a foreign character. Obviously, the earlier editions of the Encyclopedia gave an emphasis to international characters. Base Montana. And of course, with a name like Anansa, you figure she's a variation on Anansi, the African god. But this character is literally white. Everything about her is white. Her skin is white. Her hair is white. Her outfit is white. The spider that is sprung out of her head is white. So aside from femaleness, there isn't any reason for her to be in here. So her allies are her children, and her enemies are, of course, Animal Man. Background: Anansa was a giant humanoid spider with the power to read minds. Prepared to do whatever it took to protect her offspring, she harvested human bodies to feed them. Her spider children soon learned how to abduct and cocoon humans so that Anansa could feed off their dreams. The Spider Queen eventually abducted Animal Man and his son. So Animal Man, right? This is one of the launch books from the New 52, so she must have gotten reintroduced in that volume. Yes? No. So maybe she had some multimedia representation, or they had plans for her coming forward. She literally has 2 appearances, the one issue of Animal Man that was referenced, and the very book that she's being referenced in here, the Encyclopedia. I mentioned that these are headshots, and what's funny is the exact same image appears on the DC Wiki page, and you see, when you see the total image, that she is naked. She has a robe on, but it's open, and so she has has breasts with visible nipples. You go down further and she has a size baby bulge. She's about ready to pop. And there's even the inference of pubic hair. So entirely inappropriate based on the usual criteria for something like this. No relevance to anything for 20 years before this book comes out. Never used again. Why is Anansa? Maybe she filled a slot and maybe they just needed somebody in terms of the alphanumeric, but that doesn't make sense either because they could have plugged anybody anywhere. There's no reason why this specific page has to end on Asmodel because there are more A's on the following page. I have no idea why this character is in this book. It makes no sense. She does not matter to anyone under any circumstances. It's a lost continuity. What is she doing here? But we will go ahead and finish out the A's to match up with who's who. There's also Atmos and the Auctioneer. And the Auctioneer actually does have a full entry in the update. He's one of the new characters that were added. I don't know why. This character was debuted in 2006, and based on his background, he is manga-con, but played straight. And who wants that? Nobody probably uses this character again. I could research and see how many appearances the Auctioneer had. That would be a total of 8, including 3 reference books, the 2016 Encyclopedia, the 2008 Encyclopedia, and the Essential Superman Encyclopedia, and then a run of 5 issues total of Action Comics and Superman, I believe, written by Kurt Busiek. The name was also used for the Red Circle group when those books were being published by DC Comics. I guess he made it in the 2008 edition. They want to acknowledge that, but that could have been Zook Spot. God, he's even giant. He's a giant who's like grabbing the Golden Gate Bridge, like a mashup of Mr. Nebula and Manga Con. It's 3:29 in the morning. I should probably go back to sleep. I actually, I got myself a new pair of glasses and, they were messing with my eyes and I decided to take a nap, kind of reset myself because my eyes had a headache. You know what I mean? So I took a nap. I woke up at like midnight, got up knowing that I wanted to work on this, even though I had apprehensions about this because it's so indulgent and just sad. And I'm not at all enthusiastic about this thing existing, but it's sort of this weird hybrid of, one of my solo shows and one of the shows where I'm talking with the guys, and it's a nice little stopgap, so I'll have something out by Friday, in part because my girlfriend didn't want to watch a Buck Rogers episode and knock one of those out. You've got a sense of what the show's going to be, and a lot of me rambling on about stuff that you probably don't care about. When you see a DC Encyclopedia, this is the kind of stuff that it's going to be, so if you don't like that, you know to avoid it going in the future. So I think now would probably be a good time to just do the comments and remind you that if you like DC specials and you don't like this, then just know that when the word Encyclopedia appears, you want to skip those episodes, and if you dig it, then cool. Mazel tov. I don't know. I really don't know why you're still here. I don't know that I'd be here with you, to be honest with you, but it is what it is. Thank you for indulging me. I'm glad you took some enjoyment out of my stopgap lazy bullshit. Oh, hey, I just remembered we always do this with the bot, so I'm just gonna let the bot take over now. Actually, you know what? Fuck it. Since I'm already recording anyway, we'll just go ahead and go with it. So usually I make the bot quote lines from a song because I find it mildly amusing, and so the lines I was gonna feed the bot was from a song by somebody you never heard of. You can look up the lyrics. This is an encyclopedia containing the Latin names of the ugliest parts of my insides. I'm choosing to use it like a compass in times of peril. I got that song by plugging the word encyclopedia into a lyric engine and choosing the best, most interesting song. It's a rap song by a fella named a name, but I don't remember what that name is. People who like the last episode and probably are tormented by the episode, this episode include The 1-8 Sage, Action Figure Collecting, Alan Middleton, Dr. Ange. By the way, I have to write it as Dr. Angie so that it's pronounced remotely correctly by the robot. And then I have to edit out the E part. Art of Esteban Calvi, Biko Django, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Chris Thompson, Dr. Pop Culture BGSU, aka Chuck Coletta, Dirk Ashton, who added thank you RSP, El Romero, Fanholes Podcast, Guido, The Hammer Strikes Random Geeky Stuff, History of Comics on Film, I Was Joe Crawford, Jeffrey Brown, John with Married with Comics Podcast, Just in Time with J&T Baggers, King Size Comics Giant Size Fun Podcast, Keith G. Baker, Longbox Crusade, Martin Gray, Matthew Barton, Maz, I want to say Maz, like Morrissey, but hopefully I'm not damning with problematic association. Mike and Alias to Me, Mila Dream, Min, Nedhead, Odell Abner Dracula, Pensador Comic, Philip McCallery, Pop Culture Affidavit, Randy Caldwell, Resurrections and Adam Warlock and Thanos Podcast, Richard G, Rob at Speculum Fight, Ryan Daly's Gender Reveal Massacre, Harper, which I think is another high point for Orion there. Satin Tights, a Wonder Woman podcast. Secret Wars and Beyond podcast. Sean Phillips, Siskoid, Son of Cthulhu, Tim Price the Podcrasher, Trekker Talk, Wonder Woman Warrior for Peace, and Xenozoic Xenophiles. Odell Say, I did this thing where it's like a Frankie Goes to Hollywood. I'm just going to continue with it. I expected the bot to do this, but man, I really need some more pomegranate Merlot. Odell Say, if we're shouting out to locally based online stores, I have to publicly thank Nostalgia Zone Maine for their decades of tremendous selection and service. Indeed, that's where I completed my Del Dracula collection. The DC game he used to play was Scribblenauts. Look, an Indigo Lantern or Black Flash and Azrael are in this. The nature of that game kind of required you to bring your geek cred to the table, and it was still fun to watch. And another way the IP can live on without comics. Question, if Marvel and or DC stop publishing comics and pivot to digital only or print on demand, what happens to the Oldsters, Neckbeards, and Wednesday Warriors? Do they accept the never-ending battle ended? Chase extant, back issues in perpetuity? I said yes, by the way. Dump their collections. My retirement portfolio has 95% back issues is why I'm asking. Cal Bennings say, great episode. Finally got around to listening today. Made something click in my head. In Stock Trades is part of the discount comic book service that is now one of DC's distributors, which explains things. They clearly aren't able to support the new job of being a DC distributor plus run their other business endeavors. Been waiting for 21 days now for my latest order from In Stock Trades and haven't even shipped yet. Can't get a response from customer service. They clearly couldn't take on the added distribution load, and In Stock Trades customers are suffering for it. Mike say, it was only a matter of time once AT&T was involved. To them, DC is just a package of numbers. Michael Wagner say, great episode. Frank was very subdued and to the point. I was ready for a multi-hour dissertation. Was a good breakdown of the waning industry. The preceding program is a non-profit fan production. Any copyrighted materials contained therein are believed borrowed under fair use with no copyright infringement intended. Please feel free to leave comments at Rolled Spine's Productions WordPress blog. You can also send us Twitter comments through the Rolled Spine Podcast Twitter. Thank you for listening.